Hello, this is Dr. Mary again. Welcome to the course overview for the Ethnic Studies 4200 Racial and Ethnic Experiences class. So the intent of the course overview is to really frame the overall kind of theoretical thrust or approach for the 4 parts of this course by going over the 2 course readings by renowned American sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva that are located in the course introduction week 1 section of the syllabus. And with this overview, there are no assignments associated with these 2 readings. There will be multiple choice questions taken from these 2 readings during the first unit exam. So I'm going to show you where the readings and the course introduction itself, or the course overview itself, is located on our Canvas course shell. So as you can see here, I'm on our Canvas course shell and I'm going into the student view. And this is what you should appear for you on your end, since this is the student view. And I just want to remind you that with the announcement section of our Canvas course shell, I will always post regular updates about upcoming deadlines, any changes to deadlines or other changes to the syllabus, as well as extra credit events such as the annual Ethnic Studies events that are eligible for 5 points extra credit when you attend those. And so in addition to me posting regular updates on the announcement section of our course shell, you will also receive these announcements as emails. And since I don't know about you all, but I receive an overabundance, a deluge of emails on a daily basis. So in the instance that you may not have seen an email coming from this announcement section of our Canvas course shell, I encourage you once to twice a week to, at a minimum, to come to the announcement section on our Canvas course shell to see any updates, because they will be located here. The module section is where all of the reading materials are located. I will also have a module for just assignment instructions and or examples of assignments if I have those. This is a revamped course. This course is one that I have taught since 2018, and because Ethnic Studies is an interdisciplinary and also very dynamic academic field, we are constantly updating our courses with whatever the latest theoretical frameworks are, kind of concepts, terms, and also readings, also scholarship, also literature that actually integrate both historic and contemporary context, with doing these really critical deep dives and unpacking into not only the racialized hierarchy in the United States and worldwide, but also a hierarchy based on gender identity, sexual orientations, notions of able-bodiedness, documentation, status, religion, etc. So for the purposes of the course overview, I have included the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to touch on in this overview video here in the week 1 module on our Canvas course shell. That actually also, the labels are very, very self-explanatory. So the week 1 module on our Canvas course shell that has the syllabus, the course introduction, PowerPoint presentation, and also the course introduction video that includes an introduction of me, Dr. Mary. It also includes the course intro or course overview readings, PowerPoint presentation, and this video. So this is all, these are the last items. I am creating this video, so I will not upload it until I have finished creating the video. And so here is where the 2 readings, and I really should change the order of these, which I will do. Let me see. I don't know if I can do in student form. So I'm going to leave student view. And the 2 readings, which are the 2 Eduardo Bonilla Silva readings, one of which provides this overarching, very critical, like sociological, but also ethnic studies framework for understanding racism as being very systemic, right? And as being historically based, and also as being perpetuated currently in our institutions, for example, within our criminal justice system, within our electoral system, where larger and larger groups of people across the country are being disenfranchised or stripped of their right to vote, whether it's looking at K through 12 and higher education, where there's this big push for outright censorship. All of whether it's speaking of laws and legislation, where the United States, unfortunately, is reviving a longstanding history of codifying discrimination or legalizing discrimination within our laws, especially at the state level with the plethora of anti-LGBTQIA plus laws, the increasingly restrictive statewide laws, as well as the federal repealing of Roe versus Wade, which has to do with a lot more than abortion. It has to do with cisgender women and also transgender women, women identified people being totally stripped almost completely of their bodily autonomy, of sovereignty over our bodies, right? In terms of accessing all kinds of reproductive health care resources, such as easy access to birth control, hormonal treatment, right, for et cetera, et cetera. So again, the first reading, What Makes Systemic Racism Systemic, is really critical to framing this entire course, because this course is dedicated to doing a deep dive into the constructions of race, ethnicity, and also gender identities, socioeconomic status, historically and currently in the United States, and how they have changed over time, and how we inherited this model actually not only from the United States, but from colonization itself, with a number of European countries at the forefront of that, and specifically in relation to the United States, England, right? The United States, with the onset of colonization, there were a number of European countries jockeying for land conquest and engaging different degrees of genocide, and ultimately, in what is now called the United States, the United States prior to the Revolutionary War were called the 13 English colonies. So very, very structural, right? Very systemic. This is not about individualizing. It is not about taking any of the foundation of our laws, of our institutions, of even our cultural norms and behaviors at this kind of really superficial individual level, at a level that is decontextualized out of the historic context, right, in which we can never understand history, and we will always err on the side of repeating history unless we do make sense of all of the institutions across societies for thousands of years as being socially constructed by human beings. So it goes far beyond kind of individual choice, right? Individual acts of prejudice or racism, even though we also know, and according to Eduardo Bonilla Silva, that systemic racism is actually upheld by actors, and it's also challenged by actors, right? And that is known as agency. So what I encourage you to do is to read these two articles prior to going into the course introduction or the course overview, or you can wait until afterwards. It's up to you. I am pulling out major points, right? Key takeaway terms, concepts, and also issues from these two readings. And I'm condensing it into a PowerPoint presentation. And so here it is within, actually right here, accessible on our Canvas course shell. And I'm going to go ahead and just download the PowerPoint document, because I like to present through depicting the slideshow itself by projecting the full slideshow itself. So in order to make sense of, here we go, from beginning, the key course overview in terms of racial and ethnic experiences is to understand that race, along with gender identities, along with sexual orientations, along with any kind of institution, starting with the institution of the family, right, within an anthropological perspective. I am an interdisciplinary ethnic studies scholar, and I have a background in history, international relations, anthropology from the 4 subfield approach at the master's degree and doctoral level, and also a particular emphasis in anthropology of education, with my focus being critical anthropology of policy, as well as urban education, right? Very applied, very critical. And so in addition to being an interdisciplinary ethnic studies scholar, in terms of my own training and education, I also continue to draw from critical scholarship from a variety of different academic disciplines, as do our courses. So the key point from this course, Racial and Ethnic Experiences, is that racism is a social construction, and it was created, let's say, within a current day 21st century Western, especially US context, at the onset of colonization, in order to justify the very small group of people in hoarding the vast amount of resources around the world, which continues to the present day. Hard stop. And the colonization that we're looking at is the racialization, the whole hierarchy that the US inherited in particular is from England. And the first country that still in the northern part remains colonized to this day, that was subjected to these kind of constructions of race, of groups that are categorized as beneath whatever the dominant group is, which for the last 500 years have been those classified as white, being animalistic, being prone to violence, being prone to uncontrollable urges, especially uncontrollable sexual urges, being subhuman, right? Having subpar intellect, being considered deviant and unattractive, right? Undesirable in every way, despite wide-scale systemic rape of men, women, and children throughout this process for the last 500 years that continues to the current day. And so this kind of hierarchy was first enacted looking at the English, but on the Irish, okay? And so then it got exported worldwide, including to the US. That's to understand racism as systemic. And the whole purpose of the system was created, again, was to justify and to continue a select group in terms of US right after the Revolutionary War intersections of race, gender, and socioeconomic status. Because the only group of people in the US to have the full rights of citizenship after the American Revolution were wealthy, right, plantation owning, land owning, white, cisgender men. So men who identified with the gender assigned to them at birth. No women in the US, right, from its inception had the right to vote. No people of color were fully enfranchised, right, had the full rights of citizenship. And no people who were not wealthy had the full rights of citizenship. So it was a very select group. That's the systemic origins of racism in the US. This is just a little bit of background information about Eduardo Bonilla Silva. And what's really important, I gave a very, very, very brief historic kind of snapshot of what Eduardo Bonilla Silva means by racism as being systemic, because he, in these 2 articles, goes into much more contemporary ways that systemic racism continues to evolve. And Eduardo Bonilla Silva is from Puerto Rico. He would be considered Afro-Latinx, or a Latinx individual who has phenotypically or physical features, skin color, hair texture, where it denotes him as clearly, I mean, he's mixed and he has clear features that show that he is of African descent. and where that's showing up physically. Phenotype is the physical expression of the genes. And of course, Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States. So current day colonization is what scholars refer to as colonialism, and literally any part of the world that's characterized politically, economically as a territory, right? That's just a colony. That's just a colony of another country. And so he is a very critical political sociologist. He is a professor at Duke University, and he actually was elected as president of the American Sociological Association in 2018. Now, the new form what this slide, the main points I'm taking out is from a number of readings. It's from a number of Eduardo Bonilla Silva publications, which are referencing not only the 2 articles that you were assigned to read, but also some articles from his really canonical book, Racism Without Racists. And so in the late 20th and 21st century, these are the key points of Eduardo Bonilla Silva's main argument, that according to popular belief in the US, and I would say throughout much of the Western world, races are few and far between, right? Because racism, according to him, is not seen as a system. So it's reduced to individual acts of racialized prejudice and bias. I mean, even taking it out of the institutionalized discriminatory, right, context. So this is the main argument that he's making and that he's countering about 21st century systemic racism. Another commonly held belief that he argues is false is that discrimination, or literally enacting laws, the unequal application of laws, restricting access to opportunities, whether it be living in a safe neighborhood, affordable health care, affordable childcare, paid sick leave during COVID, right? For essential workers who were literally, for all intensive purposes, forced to work during COVID, but then did not receive paid sick leave or even basic like masks and hand sanitizer to keep them, just like to take the bare minimum of preventative measures from contracting COVID, right? These are discriminatory practices. So what the commonly held belief that Eduardo Bonilla Silva is making, especially the latter part of the 20th century, before Black Lives Matter, before the murder of George Floyd, we get into social justice movements, and the main point that he makes about social justice movements, and that's so critical because that intersects directly with ethnic studies, which is a field that centers social justice activism. But most people believed, up until very recently, that discrimination has all but disappears, that the civil rights movements of the 1960s got rid of it. That was a common belief. So just gonna pause. Okay. So in that most whites and most people, I would push on this tenet of how Eduardo Bonilla Silva pivots and argues that most people are colorblind. And color blindness itself, according to Eduardo Bonilla Silva, is a form of racism. And this is a form of racism where individuals can simply, and wherever we fall on the racialized hierarchy, and even people of color, including Black people themselves, are conditioned to be colorblind. It's really limiting our understanding of the systemic nature of that these institutions, these processes, all of our institutions were set up and maintained for the vast majority of the time that the US has even been a country in extremely racialized, discriminatory ways, in ways that discriminated based on gender, right? In ways that discriminate based on gender identities, in ways, actual laws, and that we're seeing the resurgence of legislation that also is actively discriminating against entire groups of people, for example, based on gender identities, sexual orientation, and gender. So it's limiting, for example, the argument that he makes in his the second reading from the course overview is we missed, or many people missed, the lessons of COVID-19 and really exposing these kinds of discriminatory inequities that have existed for ever since the inception of the US, especially as a country, with the ratification of the US Constitution in 1789, right? And they continue, right? These inequities and these kinds of oppressions continue to the current day. And COVID-19 really revealed this and exposed this. And yet there was a master narrative, right? A discourse that was disseminated throughout COVID that really covered up the long-standing inequities that really got exacerbated and exposed at the same time. Those are the main arguments that he's making. This is a definition of systemic racism, right? You can read this as you go through the PowerPoint presentation. And the key point that Bonilla Silva is making here is that while we do have and have had an alarming increase in organized hate, right, and organized white supremacy, and really have a sizable portion of the country across, right, racialized, ethnic, gender, socioeconomic lines that are increasingly overtly white supremacists, that are increasingly anti-Semitic, right? A lot of anti-Semitism that's reviving and has been on the increase exponentially in the US since 2016. We see this even with, for example, African Americans not being immune to anti-Semitism. There are groups that like Asians for Trump, despite former President Trump calling COVID-19 literally the Chinese flu, the Wuhan virus, right? So conditioning works in the following ways. And this is really a critical anthropological perspective. We have been conditioned into this ideology and this system for 500 plus years. And none of us is immune to this conditioning. And as I tell my students, melanin is a protection against ultraviolet radiation. It is not a protection against conditioning. So we do have the really extreme kind of, I wouldn't say resurgence, but as the demographic shift in the US continues to take place, we know that the elephant in the room is that this country is going to be a majority, quote unquote, minority, and the politicized definition of minority, not based on numbers, that lesser numbers than, but the majority of people in the US, it's been predicted by social scientists by 2042, it's going to be majority people of color. And for the first time, and yet during the colonial era, there were times when people of color outnumber white people in the US for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to get into that. So what's happening is the entire system, right, of systemic racism based on white supremacy, all white supremacy is placing everyone and everything classified as white as superior to everyone and everything else. So what an example of this would be the fact that education in the US has always been based on a very narrow Western European kind of not only content, information, and then later on, right, white American, but also ways of knowing, ways of producing knowledge or epistemologies, even what we consider to be intellect, right? It's all very, very much based on a very white, like Eurocentric kind of perspective. And so that's intensive white supremacy because it's upholding, right, knowledge, ways of producing knowledge, and even notions of intelligence itself as that associated with the Western world, with Europe, and then later on with white America. That's white supremacy. So it's not simply extreme, right, white supremacists such as the Proud Boys, such as QAnon, such as the plethora of organized white supremacist hate groups, right? It goes beyond that. And another argument that Bonilla Silva is making in these two readings is that systemic racism exacerbated the effects of COVID-19 on racialized groups. And COVID-19 also exacerbated the existing inequities. So here is a definition of systemic racism, or racism as a structure. And so it encompasses social relations as well as social, political, economic, and ideological frameworks that shape the life chances of the various racialized groups. We know that there is no such thing as race. It is a social construction. Gender is a social construction. For thousands of years, societies and civilizations throughout North and South, Central and South America, throughout the continent of Africa, throughout Asia, had multiple gender identities, multiple. It is in more than one, more than two, more than three, more than four. So all of it is socially constructed. It is based to some degree on biology, right? Nature and nurture. And the bottom line is that human beings are evolved to have the largest brains of any other species in relation to our size, especially, and it is because we are evolved to have what's called neuroplasticity. What that means is all of our behaviors are learned. All of our behaviors are taught. They have to be taught and learned. So we construct everything within us, right? Within certain parameters. So here is a video that, and with this PowerPoint presentation, the PowerPoint presentations that are going to be posted in, on our Top Hat teaching engagement platform are going to be pretty much the same, except there will be questions connected with the videos that you will have to answer for credit. And so this is a video that does, it's really, really a great video because it breaks down what is colorblind racism further, and it also gets into the history of race as a social construction. So I really encourage you to watch this video on your own time to get a much deeper understanding. And for example, on the unit exams, I'm definitely going to have some discussion questions and that are referencing video clips, and that take a greater degree of critical thinking. So asking questions about, for example, scenario questions, sharing a particular scenario and asking why or why not you think this example demonstrates colorblind racism, and then making 2 to 3 key points, right, based on the readings, based on videos such as these that provide the current and historic context. So another example of structural or systemic racism, when we look at peoples of African descent in the US from 1619 to the current day, for example, chattel slavery, Jim Crow segregation, mass selective incarceration, which disproportionately targets Black and Latinx communities, and increasingly individuals from poor or economically marginalized communities, and then police brutality, which has actually been a longstanding issue for actually Black, Latinx, Native American, and Asian American communities, and has been one of the core calls to action of social justice activism movements, like for hundreds of years, and specifically for decades and decades, and specifically with the modern civil rights movement, and also with the Black Power movement, with the Asian American Power movement, with the Red Power or American Indian movement, and with the Brown Power or Chicano social justice movement of the 1960s and early 70s. So here is a link, I know it's difficult to see, to an extensive article where we're shifting into Eduardo Bonilla Silva's deep dive into systemic racism being COVID-19 exacerbating the longstanding inequities. And it really does get into the data. It's a governmental, right? Policy is a huge way to combat systemic discrimination and marginalization of any kind, including systemic racism. And so this is more of a policy kind of, it has a chart that has a lot of data So I really encourage you of what is common knowledge now of how Black, Latinx, and Native American communities in particular were hit extremely disproportionately hard by COVID. And it had to do with a number of reasons, including these groups being more likely to be working as essential workers. Also, whether we're talking about in healthcare, retirement homes, also with like factory work, like with Amazon for actually as a result of its deplorable conditions during COVID, when the former CEO of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, I mean, these corporations were recording record-breaking profit margins during COVID. And a lot of that was on the backs of their workers who were doing the literal heavy lifting in the warehouses, who were not being provided, like I said, with basic preventative measures such as masks, hand sanitizers. They were not afforded, with all of these millions and millions and millions of dollars that they're literally the lifeline, right? The blood in the veins is being able to ship, being able to pack all of this product and move all of this product, where online shopping went and consumerism went through the roof. And this resulted in the first historic creation of the first labor union with Amazon, and it's the Amazon Labor Union. It's an amazing story. So, right, but this is part of, and most of the workers were overwhelmingly Black and brown, from less economically advantaged backgrounds, and also a span of age ranges, but also young, right? So even thinking about how, I mean, we really started to see how teenagers, teachers, educators were dying in schools during COVID as well. So I encourage you to look this up, to dig into and even the data and also charts around how COVID-19 exacerbated systemic racism, and yet that was not acknowledged. And there was this kind of narrative that Eduardo Bonilla Silva talks about and references as we're all in this together, and COVID is the great equalizer, but it really wasn't, actually. It really wasn't. What I include here is a chart that we're talking about intersectionality that was coined by another sociologist in 1989 by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw, is that we belong as human beings, we're multidimensional. We belong to a variety of different socially constructed categories simultaneously. For example, I am not merely Black, I am also a woman, I am also cisgender, right? I am also able-bodied, even though I was born differently abled, and it was a condition that my parents were able to reverse, right? So we belong to all of these socially constructed categories at the same time. That is, and that within a lens of intersectionality as a theory, is that we experience multiple oppressions, multiple marginalizations, and sometimes also marginalizations and privilege at the same time, and that these interact in different and contradictory ways. So what is not discussed very much at all, which I think is very interesting, especially around Roe versus Wade and ongoing state level legislation, and that really continues to strip away women and cis and transgender women's reproductive rights, is that Black women are disproportionately, regardless of socioeconomic status, are dying at alarming rates prior to giving birth, during birth, and immediately after birth. And the mortality rate of Black infants is extremely high. So this just shows that when comparison with non-Hispanic or non-Latinx Black women in the US, this is just maternal deaths, right? This is a mortality, it's called the mortality gap for US or based moms. There are in the United States, 40 Black women die prior to pregnant or giving birth or immediately after giving birth, for every 100,000 people, 40 Black women die as opposed to 12.4 non-Latinx white women. And so this is, and then it has a further comparison of women of all races from a variety of countries. And we can see that the mortality rate of Black women, maternal mortality rate, is the same as that of women of all racialized backgrounds in Malaysia. And it's actually worse than women of all racialized backgrounds in Mexico, for example. Like this was happening before COVID. So this data is demonstrating a key part of Eduardo Bonilla Silva's argument, which is that COVID-19 exacerbated already existing systemic racism, especially when it comes to healthcare and access and having to take jobs where the pay is low. You don't have the resources, despite generating millions and millions, even billions of dollars of profit within these multinational corporations, not having paid sick leave, even though the government is classifying these workers as essential workers. And so they're forced to work. Just examples. The next slide is about a couple of different ways when Eduardo Bonilla Silva talks about social justice movements and how they have functioned historically and continue to function in the US. It's also really important to look at the policy side, to look at who we elect, all the way from municipal or city-wide positions and even school boards, all the way up to the state and federal level matters as well, because of policies, right? Early childhood development, especially through Head Start, was historically in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, I think even through the 90s and early 2000s, a very popular early childhood development program at the level of the US Congress on the part of both Republicans and Democrats. And these are programs, it's a program that, based on short-term and long-term, or what's known as long-term longitudinal data, has tremendous significant, what you would say as a social scientist, significant positive impacts through policy changes, right? Then another example is not just in terms of, in addition to Head Start, looking at anti-poverty programs such as Earned Income Tax Credit for children, SNAP, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, unemployment insurance, which we actually pay for. It comes out of our paychecks. So we actually pay for that out of our paychecks. And so it's that in the case that someone is laid off or fired, are the two primary ways of being able to be eligible to collect unemployment. If you have not worked a job where unemployment insurance is not being deducted from your paycheck, then you will not be eligible to connect unemployment insurance in the instance that you're fired or laid off. If you're never fired or laid off from a job and you leave, that money gets taken out of your paycheck and you never collect it, right? But these are some examples of the impacts in terms of policy. And then I'm going to wind down and actually wrap up this course overview by the point that Eduardo Bonilla Silva makes about the impact of social justice movements. Ethnic studies is a discipline and is the only academic discipline that was created as the result of the longest student strike in the history of the US, right? And it's actually within the larger context of the civil rights and Black power movements, of the Brown power movement, of the American Indian movement, and of the Asian American social justice movements of the 60s, that we even get those students, right, at San Francisco State University within the California State University system, even really, even forming the student organizations that they did and coming together, right, in co-solidarity in the ways that they did. And this can only be understood within the larger context of the global decolonization movement that was happening primarily throughout Asia and the continent of Africa in the 60s, because it wasn't until the 1960s that we have independence movements throughout Africa and Asia, for example. And that's why the students that came together at San Francisco State University called themselves the Third World Liberation Front group, right? Strikers, because they were placing themselves squarely in the context of BIPOC people all over the world reclaiming their sovereignty, reclaiming their independence, okay, from Europe. Now, in 2023, there's new waves of colonialism happening, for example, throughout the continent of Africa, primarily being spearheaded by China and India. So it's not Europe anymore, okay? And so, according to Eduardo Bonilla Silva, social justice movements affect society in the following ways. These movements force change. They cleanse souls. So he's framing social justice movements in a much more holistic way that goes beyond a white supremacist, Eurocentric conceptualization of what scholarship is. In the quote unquote academy, that's what academia is called, scholarship and literature talking about cleansing souls, that's usually completely devalued. But within a larger, more critical, right, pre and beyond trans colonized world, the way that we validate and legitimize knowledge goes far beyond. It can only be from the head up. It can only be cerebral. It can only be, right, rational and empirical and objective. Oh no. Even the notion of forcing change, right, goes beyond a Western epistemology, ways of producing knowledge, ways that we've been thinking about or conceptualizing what constitutes knowledge, right? This is what it means to decolonize our scholarship, our learning, our intellect. Social justice movements, especially more recent ones, help to remove the symbols of the past, i.e. Confederate statues, the Confederate flag, taking off the flags, such as the state flag in South Carolina, right? This is happening literally within the last, since 2018. And if we set the stage back, the timeline back to Black Lives Matter, it originates in 2013 after the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murder. So that, and here is a video that provides a breakdown of the evolving nature of social justice movements. Now, it's primarily focusing on Black Lives Matter, especially in large part due to its explosion as a global worldwide movement in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. It also looks at social justice movements of the 21st century and how they are similar to and distinct from social justice movements, which according to US-based Native Americans, literally started in 1492 on Turtle Island, or what is otherwise known Homeland Security since 1492 from the perspective of US-based Native Americans. We can also see social justice movements of the 21st century in the US as really, really showing us a resurgence of movements to unionize, which had gotten very, very, very gutted in this country because multinational corporations want to hoard the largest amount of profits that they can, and coming directly at the expense of wages, right? That people who are actually doing the hard work are actually earning, but their compensation is not reflecting the actual value of the work that they are doing. And so we can see this with the first ever historic Amazon labor union. We can see this with Starbucks is in the midst of a union movement where they were just found guilty by the NLRB, or the National Labor Relations Board, of enacting union busting tactics. K through 12 teachers. This has been K through 12 teachers or public school educators. There's decades and decades of striking. Nurses, right, over especially again, COVID-19 exacerbating a lot of the existing inequities, largely based on gender when it came to K through 12 teachers and nurses as well. We also see right here in California, the largest strike conducted by academic workers in the history of the United States just happened a few months ago. Well, back in the fall of 2022, within the University of California, and the academic workers, which means postdocs, graduate students who are doing the lion's share of the teaching of courses, of grading, of advising students. And there were 48,000 people who went on strike. There were 48,000 people within the UC system. So social justice movements have historically and continue to be really the primary vehicle of change or change agents that we see not only in the US, but also across the world. And that concludes the overview of racial and ethnic experiences.